All right, take your Bibles, if you would, and join me in turning to the book of Psalms. We'll be in Psalm 85 as we finish up this afternoon. Psalm 85 this afternoon. My only complaint about the lunch. Now, I know I talked about being content, but my only complaint is I only could eat that soup one bowl at a time. You can't do that like you do. Typically, you go to a homecoming, you can put 4 or 5 different things on your plate. With soup, it's all or nothing. And so, I walked through. I just walked all the way down the line, figured out what I wanted, then I got back in the line, and then I got what I wanted, and I sat down and ate it, and then I went for round 2 and got another. If anybody who made the salads, I'm sorry, but I didn't eat salad. I just made it a soup day. I like salad, but so many different soups there. And so I appreciate the hospitality that you folks have shown. And again, it's a joy to be able to be with you on this special day. And I want to conclude our time together by maybe giving you a little bit of hope. I know right now in Virginia, you folks have an election coming up on Tuesday, and North Carolina, the stakes aren't quite as high across the border for us. I know that you've got a governor race, and there's a lot of things that have been said in recent days, and I certainly am praying with many of you that the person who will respect biblical principles, that those are the kind of people in our government, because we know that righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. That's a Bible principle regardless of what party you're with. And I believe that to be true. And so, but sometimes we get to focusing so much on the news that we forget about the Word. Now, if you don't have that problem, then thank you for visiting from heaven today. I'm glad you're here. But this afternoon, I do want to speak to you on a subject that I think is more important than politics. It's a lot more important than politics. You say, what is that? It's this: revival. When I mention the word revival, I don't know what comes to your mind. It all depends on what has shaped your opinion about revival. Several years ago, there was a documentary that was published. I think it was made by ABC or one of those big news networks. And you can mark it down. When a big news network tries to give you religion or anything spiritual, it's a mess. And they documented a couple of so-called revivals. One that was taking place in Brownsville, Florida. One that was taking place in Toronto, Canada. And they videoed it. And in the services, there were literally people that were rolling on the floors, laughing uncontrollably. And they called it revival. And I thought it was a great misfortune, because hopefully for discerning Christians, they were angered. But for a viewing audience that's largely ignorant of spiritual things, it gave a totally false concept of revival. In the Bible, when God was moving in an amazing way, in a very powerful way, you didn't find people rolling on the floors laughing uncontrollably. But you found them like Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6, when he said, "Woe is me, for I am undone. I'm a man of unclean lips." You understand that when a man sees God for who He is, and a man realizes what He is, there's a great sense of holiness and repentance and drawing nigh to God that takes place on an entirely different level. And so this afternoon, I want to briefly challenge you in the area of revival, and I just go as far to say this, is I believe that it's possible today for God to revive people in the Vision Baptist Church, Ambassador Baptist College. I'm just thinking in this day and time, regardless of who's in charge of the government, regardless of what issues we face, I believe with all of my heart that God can send revival. And I'd like to share with you this afternoon why. Psalm 85, beginning in verse number 1, it says, Lord, thou hast been favorable unto thy land. Thou hast brought back the captivity of Jacob. Thou hast forgiven the iniquity of thy people. Thou hast covered all their sins, Selah. Thou hast taken away all thy wrath. Thou hast turned thyself from the fierceness of thine anger. Turn us, O God of our salvation, and cause thine anger toward us to cease. Wilt thou be angry with us forever? Wilt thou draw out thine anger to all generations? And then verse 6 is our text. Wilt thou not revive us again, that thy people may rejoice in thee? And this afternoon, I want to give you what I call the fourfold question of revival. In verse number 6, the psalmist asks a question. He said, Wilt thou not revive us again, that thy people may rejoice in thee? And ladies and gentlemen, I believe that that is a question that every one of us in this room would do well to ask God. It is a centuries old question that needs to be asked in 2021. You know, just by way of introduction, when I look at God moving in the Old Testament and the New Testament and also in Christian history and things that we would term as revival, I see several things that to me are very evident. One is I believe that when God sends revival, there is an intense sense of God's presence. Now, I stand before you this afternoon telling you that I realize God is in this room. God is everywhere. Did you know that? The eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. I don't question whether or not God is everywhere. Here's what I question. Are we aware that He's in the room? Can I tell you, when revival comes, God's people are aware that He is there and they behave accordingly. The Bible tells us in in Exodus, God tells Moses in Exodus 33 and verse 14, He said, My presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest. And Moses told the Lord, he said, If thy presence go not with me, carry us not up hence. Basically, Moses said, God, if you're not going, I don't want to go. I'm going to tell you, would to God that all of His children would have that heartbeat. Lord, I don't want to be somewhere unless that's your leading. And He's talking about this matter of presence. When revival takes place, there's an intense sense of God's presence. I've also found that when revival takes place, that there's a deep heart searching and confession of sin. A deep heart searching and confession of sin. People ask me about instances of revival in the Old Testament. I tell them, look at Hezekiah. Look at Ezra. Look at Nehemiah. Yes, I know buildings were being built and some of that, but there was a far greater work that was taking place in the hearts of the people of Israel. And my contention is that the work would have never been done on the walls had God not done a work in hearts. But I think about Ezra. When Ezra saw the state of his nation, Ezra 9 and verse 6, he said, I am ashamed and blush to lift my face to thee, my God, for our iniquities are increased over our head, and our trespass is grown up into the heavens. Ezra had an awareness of where they were at before God, and he knew that it demanded confession. I know we think to ourselves, well, confession, that sort of kills revival, doesn't it? No, confession precedes it. Confession's not a revival killer. It may be a revival bringer. But when God moved mightily, not only did I see a deep heart-searching confession of sin and an awareness of the presence of God, but I've also seen a renewed appreciation for God's Word. In the Old Testament, when they rediscovered the law, it was a very humbling thing. Evan Roberts, who was involved in the revival in Wales in the early 1900s, he would stand before people and sometimes preach very basic Bible texts. The story is told that one day he stood before a congregation and he read Romans 5:8. But God commendeth his love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. All he did was read the verse, and the hearts of sinners and saints alike were melted. And yet we can read a text like that in some of our churches and roll our eyes and say, well, I've seen that before. That may be the problem. We've taken the Bible for granted. And when revival comes, I think there's also, number 4, a deep spiritual awakening among Christians, a tiredness of being mechanical. I am all for an order of service. I am all for service time set on Sunday. But can I tell you, within those times that we set apart, sometimes we become so mechanical and so predictable. There needs sometimes to be desperately a freshness in the house of God. The Bible tells us in Romans chapter 13 and verse 11, and that knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep. For now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. The night is far spent. The day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. And I really do believe in our churches that's the need of the hour. But now in the next few moments, I want to show you the fourfold question of revival. And I want to challenge you at the end of this service to humbly ask God the same question that the psalmist asked many years ago when he said, wilt thou not revive us again, that thy people may rejoice in thee? I want you to see, first of all, that it's a question of realization. Remember verse 6, wilt thou not revive us again, that thy people may rejoice in thee? It is a question, and I propose to you that it's a question of realization. You say, what do you mean a question of realization? I believe that in order for the man to ask God for this particular petition, he had to realize a couple of things. The first thing he had to realize is this: he had to realize the need for revival. No man is ever going to ask God, will you revive us again, unless they think they need it. I mean, let me ask a challenging and a convicting question. I wonder how many of us Christians in this room, before we walked on the church property today, when's the last time we asked God to revive us? And just plain words. I don't think any of us would want to volunteer that, but I would tell you this: it probably indicates whether or not we think we need revival. I think if I asked the question, how many of you think we need revival? I think everybody would raise their hands. Can I tell you, it's not the hand raising, but it's when's the last time we've actually asked God for it that really reveals whether or not we believe we need it. My wife, several years ago, went to get a root canal done. Boy, that was an investment. Anytime you go to the dentist, I imagine it's a little bit of an investment. But I remember a few weeks after she had her root canal, I went up to her and I said, hey, honey, what's the name of that dentist that you went to? And she looked at me as if to say, why are you asking that? I said, well, I've got a tooth that's been bothering me. And I said, I think I need to call and make an appointment. And make an appointment I did. I called and they found a cavity and they drilled so deep I thought they were drilling for oil, but they finally struck it and got it and filled it, and it was all better. But I'm going to tell you, I never would have asked for a dentist unless I thought I needed one. I don't think any of you just look around to somebody recreationally and say, you know what, I'd like to have some fun today. I want to go to the doctor. I'm learning the older you get, the more of them you see, it seems like. And just like a man's not going to ask for a dentist unless he thinks he needs one, no man in this room is going to ask for revival unless he or she thinks she needs it. Now, let me tell you what we're really good at. We're really good at this, saying he needs revival. Yeah, that woman, she needs it. But I'll tell you, blessed be the day when we become aware of how much we personally need to hear from God and we yield ourselves. What am I saying? You're never going to say, Lord, wilt thou not revive us again, unless you think you need it. You're here and you say, I'll have you to know I've been saved for a long time. Well, as we'd say here in the South, bless your heart. I'll tell you what, while we're just swapping that, why don't I just say, well, I'm a president, I'm an evangelist. Let's just go ahead and make our useless list. Listen to me, Hezekiah was a king, but he thought he needed revival. Nehemiah was a cupbearer. I don't care what we are, we ought to see ourselves, we need revival more than we think we do. I have a problem with myself. You may not have it, but here's the problem that I have. I often think of myself higher than I ought. Now, I've just said the one thing about me that maybe some of you refuse to admit about yourself, but that's our human nature. Never one time did God ever command me to be proud. Now, there's two reasons for that. Number one, it's sin. He would never tell us to do wrong. Number two, He doesn't have to tell me to do something that comes so naturally. And when I read the Bible, I constantly find this cry, like 2 Chronicles 7:14, if my people which are called by my name shall humble themselves. James 4:10, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He shall lift you up. 1 Peter 5:6, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time. You know how you humble yourself? I'll tell you how you humble yourself. Just be brutally honest. That's how you humble yourself. The older you get, the more humbling it is to admit your age. Things you can't do like you used to do. But sometimes a little bit of honesty along that regards will save you a lot of pain in the future. You go out there and you act like you're a 25-year-old and you're 50 or 60, and you pay the price afterwards. It pays to humble yourself sometimes and say, you know what, I'm not made, as the old song went, the old gray mare ain't what she used to be. But you know what? There's a real power that comes with honesty. When a man is honest before God and he says, you know what? I know all these people think I'm just a cut above, but Lord, you know me in the innermost part of my being, and you humble yourself before God. When we reach there, then we'll begin to cry, we need revival. But not only did he realize the need for revival, he realized the source of revival. Wilt thou not revive us again? Who brings revival? Is it the evangelist that brings it out of his pocket and throws it out to you? Is it the veteran pastor that, no. Is it the charismatic personality? It amazes me with the younger generation on this app called TikTok. And you have they're called influencers. They're on YouTube. They get millions of views and they influence lots of people. Is it a very charismatic person that brings revival? No. It's very simply found in this verse, in the word thou. Brother Farnham, who's here, Brother Farnham was that ambassador years ago too, when I was in the Dean of Students office. And one of the reasons that Brother Farnham and Brother Hill and I probably chose ambassador, because being a Bible college, you didn't have to take biology, physics, history of civilization, algebra. It's wonderful. They gave you Bible, but there was one class that we could not escape. It was called English. And this happens to be the language that we're supposed to be preaching in. But when I sat in English, Mrs. Rosenau reminded me of something that I probably learned in high school that I'd forgotten. She would teach me when there was a pronoun, that pronoun had what was called an antecedent. The pronoun he, she, or it, antecedent is what is he, she, or it referring to. So if I said he hit me and Pastor Hill was the one who hit me, then Pastor Hill is the antecedent. It's who the pronoun's referring to. All right, class, here's my question. When the Bible says, wilt thou not revive us again, who is thou referring to? Then you know the source of revival. God can. God is the source of it. The same God that convicted your heart and brought you to salvation is the same God that can work in your heart mightily and do a mighty work. You say, well, we don't have a lot of personalities here. We don't have the charisma that the larger churches have. Listen to me, if you have God, you have access to the source of revival. Number one, it's a question of realization. Number two, it's a question of repetition. And it's found in this one word, wilt thou not revive us? Here it is again. Now, I want to be very blunt. I usually try to be tactful, but I hope you can be tactful and blunt at the same time. Some people are blunt. They're like a bull in a china shop. I try not to be that way. But if I could just bluntly say, I think one of the biggest obstacles that may be in revival to our churches today are negative, pessimistic people who are focused on the wrong thing. Now, I understand all of us in this room, listen, we probably fall under negative, pessimist, optimist, or realist. You know, we could take a survey and some of you immediately be identified as pessimists. Some of you would be identified as optimists, and then there's some of you that bow up and say, well, I'm a realist. Sometimes I think a realist is just a pessimist in optimistic clothing. That's all I believe. Here's what I'm saying. You know, even for me, it's so easy to watch the news. It's so easy to hear different things. And then you come to a conclusion apart from the Bible. You say, there's no way God can work. And there's a grave danger in coming to conclusions apart from the Bible. You say, well, that's just the way I feel about things today. Your feelings aren't always right, are they? You know, after this service is over with, pastor's going to take me down the interstate to the airport so I can get home. And chances are there'll be some driver from up north that just drives and cuts us off. Just cuts right in front of us. And maybe there's a little brake slamming going on. Let me ask you, how you feel when that happens? Yeah, you're like, I feel sanctified. No, you don't. If you operated off of those feelings, guess what? You'd probably be in jail. You'd be having a jail ministry. But you know, those are, real feelings that people have. You know, there's some people, you're like, man, I've just stopped watching Fox News, or I watch CNN, or I watch, whatever outlet you want to look at. And you're just like, there is no way God can work in that mess. All I'm asking you to do is don't come to your conclusions apart from the Bible. Because here the psalmist said, wilt thou not revive us again? In other words, God, you've worked in times past. Lord, can you please work again? Now, I'm not going to do it for you because I know you want to get out of here at a decent time. But I'll tell you one thing I would challenge you to do is when you read about revivals in the Old Testament, you tell me what was in the backdrop of those revivals. Sometimes man was found doing some very awful stuff, like sacrificing babies in a valley. I hear people, and they're like, I'm going to tell you, with American abortion, there's no way we can have revival. And I'm thinking, man, back in Israel's day, there was child sacrifice. People that had pushed the Word of God aside, wicked generations ruling. We're like, there's no way God can send revival. Listen, before you come to that conclusion, you better read the Old Testament. Because I'm telling you, God worked in the midst of some wicked administrations after the fact. God did a work in the midst of awful things happening in a nation. And I would much rather believe the Bible concept than my feelings. Do you know what the word again means? When I was, my son Andrew was 2 years old, I grabbed him up one day and we were spinning round and round and round and round. And boy, he was really enjoying it, and I was enjoying it for about 30 seconds. And all of a sudden, my world began to spin, and I had to just like slow down, and his knees dragged the ground. And no sooner than I stopped, that little boy looked up at me and he said, "Again." Again. I picked him up and I did it again. The second time wasn't nearly as long as the first. But no sooner than I set him down, again. I think I've proven to you, if a 2-year-old kid can understand what the word again means, why can't we adults? Now, you may be here and you say, "Preacher, I just don't buy into it. I forget it. I'm not going to listen to you anymore." All right, if that's you and you're just set in your ways, and some people are. Some people, you're just like, "I'm obstinate. You're not changing my mind." All right, well, that's fine. I'll tell you what, when you get out of church today, you go out to your car and I want you to take the darkest pen that you have, okay? You just take the darkest pen you have and you open up the Bible to Psalm 85:6 and you mark it out. Mark out the word again, just as dark as you can. Now, some of you say, "You're a preacher. You're a man of the cloth. Do you know what you just asked us to do?" You'd say, "Don't you remember what the Bible said about adding to or taking away in the book of the Revelation? You're cursed for that." I'm like, "You're exactly right." But here's my question. What's the difference between you doing it in your mind, sitting in an auditorium, or literally doing it in the parking lot? Can God work again in the state of Virginia with the possibility of 4 bad future years? I think so. Now, I'm hoping for the best and praying for the best on Tuesday, and I hope you're voting for the best. But when it's all said and done, listen to me, I believe God can work again. The question is do we in this room believe that? Number one, it's a question of realization. Number two, it's a question of repetition. Number three, it's a question of intercession. You know what I believe verse 6 is? Yes, it's a question, but it is a prayer. You know, sometimes when we think of praying, this is what we think. "Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy will be done, thy kingdom come." And that's a model prayer that Jesus gave. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you know, sometimes, what is a prayer in essence? A prayer is talking to God. And you know what? When I talk to God, sometimes I ask Him questions. Sometimes the prayer is not a state of some declarative statement. Sometimes it's just a question to God. You know what I believe verse 6 is? It's just a prayer. "Wilt thou not revive us again, that thy people may rejoice in thee?" Let me ask you a question. What would happen? What would happen if every person in the pews of this church sincerely, humbly asked God for revival? You say, "I don't know." My response to you is, why don't you find out? Before you came to this service, when's the last time you asked God personally for a revival in your own heart? When's the last time you asked God for revival in your church? Now, I think if a lot of us were honest, we'd say, "I'm ashamed of my answers." But that's what messages like this are for today. It's God's way of reminding us where our hearts ought to be. You're like, "Preacher, I'm going to tell you what, it's been a long time since I've asked God for anything like that." Then I'm going to tell you, instead of waiting until you go home, why don't you, at the end of this service, ask God that question? "Lord, will you not revive us again?" Lord, strengthen our homes. Lord, strengthen our families. Lord, strengthen me spiritually. Lord, revive us. Let it be a prayer that comes from your lips with great sincerity. The last thing that I'll share with you about the fourfold question of revival, the last thing is that's a question of expectation. He says, wilt thou not revive us again, that thy people may rejoice in thee? Do you know what happens when revival comes? The attention's not on man. The attention is on God. Do you know that when revival took place in the nation of Wales in the early 1900s, that Sunday soccer games were canceled? Because of poor attendance. The churches were filled instead of the stadiums. I mean, think about it this way. You know, this week is the World Series week. Even last night I watched a few innings of the World Series. And you know what? There are millions of people all over the country that, I mean, you know, they're glued. They're going to be glued on the World Series. And is there anything wrong with rejoicing over your favorite team? No, there's not. If you're like me, you just choose losing teams. There's not much rejoicing. We always seem to lose. But could you imagine a revival sweeping through an area like this, through churches, to where people forgot who was playing in the World Series or the Super Bowl? Because they were so happy with what God was doing. I remember years ago I was preaching in South Carolina, and at the conclusion of the service, there was a young man who had come for salvation. And this